Hello. All right, so it looks like they are starting 10 minutes late, but we're going to have the full hour here. I am Jean Leggett. This is...
I'm Gabriella Lowgren. Hi.
Hi. And thank you very much for joining us for what might be a little bit of a heavy hour. It's a thoughtful presentation on serious subjects and sensitive subjects in serious games. And I'm going to let Ella just do a little bit of a preamble.
Yes, of course. So just really quickly, of course a talk like this does necessitate a trigger warning. So there's a few things that we will be talking about in depth. If you have any issues with these or you're uncomfortable with the subject matter being discussed, please feel free to leave. We're not going to be worried about it. It's absolutely about your safety. And also you can come and talk to us afterwards if you have issues with any of these things or you're feeling unsafe today. We're happy to talk to you after if you still want to know about our material or you wish to speak to us about any of these issues. So are we all good? Great, fantastic. So, thank you. We'll also be making sure during this talk to be flagging more content that comes up if it's a little bit more extreme. So we will be checking in with you and getting consent at many stages during this talk, so just be aware that we'll be flagging issues.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. It's a little bit strange because it's not really conducive for us to sit. There's no clicker or anything like that, so we're just going to be sharing the podium. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be an intimate hour. I'm trying to add some funny stuff in there because, anyways.
It's going to get a little heavy, just
a little bit heavy.
A little bit.
So let's talk for a minute about the definition of game, because for those of you who have not played a lot of serious games, game to me means fun. And as somebody who has been empowering storytellers to create game content and interactive stories, I have noticed that not all the stories that are coming out are fun. Right? So let's talk about the definition of game and serious games. Games that have a primary purpose other than entertainment. We're calling them serious. I kind of like to call them interactive media, interactive storytelling. I can recall a few years ago talking to a woman who wanted to make a narrative adventure game, an interactive story. And she said, well, could we make a game about Japanese internment camps to go with the documentary that she was doing? Now, I think you probably would all agree with me that we wouldn't call that a game, right? Game implies joy and fun and all of those things. We have a lot of stories as humanity to tell. They don't necessarily fall within the umbrella of game. So let's talk about why now. And you know what? I'm just going to take one moment to... these things. I know there's here we go. Look, Ella, notes.
Fantastic. Not just from memory.
And...
Lovely.
Look. Big font. Okay, thank you. Thank you for indulging us. So, take it away.
So I'm going to give you the quickest rundown of a really interesting cultural phenomenon that we're seeing right now, and that is, of course, the rise of the indie game. But to go back a little bit further from that, we see really interesting shifts in news media and how society views art forms and emerging different mediums and art forms. So, for example, you know how games are largely vilified as bad and promoting violence in children? I'm sure you've seen a lot of media about. Just not true. But if you go back even a couple of years, we saw this with TV shows and horror movies. Before that, cinema. Before that, I'm not joking, different art movements. Before that, the novel.
Books
were bad, going to ruin society's downfall. So right now we're seeing what we call a moral panic, which happens whenever a new art form emerges, and eventually games will be seen as art and will be accepted by society. But every time something new comes out, we have to have this little bit of rumbling and unsettledness before it all becomes a bit more peachy. So we're
scary.
Just going to have the downfall of society with video games? Obviously not. So because games are becoming more popular and more than ever, we're seeing indie developers making games and making serious experiences as well. And what has made this possible is that games are becoming more popular and are slowly becoming more accepted by widestream media. But also we have more access than ever before to resources, to assets, to engines, to platforms, to social media, which means that no longer are games the domain only of AAA companies who've built their in-house engines and have really, really finely tuned machines to make products. now people can just get together and use what is quite freely accessible in some cases to create things that are beautiful and to create art. This means that diverse teams can make games and publish them quite easily. For example, Itch.io, you can just put a game up there for nothing and ask for money in return if you've got a product.
How many of you have made a game and put it up on Itch?
Ooh, this
Okay.
makes me happy.
And how many of you made a game for purely artistic purposes and maybe told 2 friends to play it? But it felt good. It felt good to get your story out there, right? And that's really what we're talking about today are 2 very specific stories. And not all games need to be made for profit. Some stories need to just be told. And we're going to be talking about the cultural tides that are rising. I know that with what's been really exciting in the indie space for the last couple of years is watching the rise of the biographical game. I think about the one that kicked off some wide discussion, which was Depression Quest. We have recent games such as That Dragon Cancer. And I remember sitting down and eating a ham bone with the guy on a grass picnic and sort of like hearing his story of why he created That Dragon Cancer and also the impact that it had on people. So for players, it was, some people were like, wow, thank you for taking me through the diagnosis, the treatment, and the passing of your son. It really impacted me. And other people said, I cannot believe you monetized that. So we need to remember as storytellers in the room that our stories are very powerful. They need to be told, and they're going to impact people. We have no control over how they impact people. I know for me, the game that I'll be talking about, Shakespeare's Landlord, is strangely at the forefront of the Me Too movement. Some sad statistics around rape in North America is that 1 in every 98 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted, and 1 out of every 6 American women has been the victim of an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. So that's almost 15% of women have experienced a completed rape. And 9 out of 10 victims of rape is female. So these are, while horribly and disturbing facts, we need to be representing them ethically and responsibly in games so that people understand that this is not something that doesn't happen. So, Ella, why don't you tell us about you?
About myself?
Yes.
Love talking about myself. So my name is Gabriella. I am a communications manager by day. Quite a few of you in this room know me, so I'm active in the Melbourne game development scene. I'm very passionate about games as a whole, and especially about indie games and mental health, which I speak about a lot because I'm passionate about it, as I mentioned. So by day, I'm a communications manager, and by night, I make indie games. And I have a very small team, and they're all amazing. And one of them's here. Hi, hello, I see you in the front row. Hi, Jairus. Singling you out. Is it uncomfortable? Oh, he's excited about it.
Did you ask
It's nice.
permission?
Probably should have established that in retrospect.
I know, it's really awful to make a joke about consent.
Has to be done sometimes. We have to be able to normalize talking about these things.
Yes, absolutely. I'm Jean Leggett. I came all the way from Toronto. I lead a small indie dev studio with my husband. And my focus is making games for women over 30. Women over 50 are the fastest growing market segment. And I think there's some really exciting opportunities to create narrative content for them. All of our games have female protagonists. And I'm looking to take my English degree and make meaningful, mature stories. And that's the kind of content creator that we're looking for, are people who are wanting to tell something that is important and impactful in the industry. I'm just really, for me, it's all about getting that resonance.
Yes.
I want people to play the stories and just be like, whoa.
Whereas for me, it's more about fostering empathy and understanding in players and doing that through gender-neutral characters and releasing games for free.
So let's talk a little bit about what the responsibility is for developers, because I don't know, I think we had this conversation last night. So we had a little pajama party with wine as we were finishing up our slides. And
It's very wholesome.
it was, and we've been talking back and forth for the last couple of months. I think we're very much on the same wavelength, that we feel that there is definitely a responsibility and a duty of care of game developers. We see ourselves as that next vanguard, the stewards of the games industry. And I believe that many of you in this room are probably also feeling the same way, that we have an ethical obligation to do good with our words. If you were at my little talk earlier this morning, do good with words. to make sure that we can explore mature and traumatic content, but to be upfront with trigger warnings, to get player consent so that they know
Yes.
that what they're getting into.
So there is an example of a game that I don't think gets consent very well, and it's a game that I did enjoy playing, and a few of you might have already twigged as to what this game is, but an example I would like to bring up is Doki Doki Literature Club, which doesn't have appropriate trigger warnings for a lot of the content contained within its narrative. So it's important that if we're going to be talking about things that are very personal and potentially very traumatic, that we have consent from players to go on that journey with them. And it is not hard to include trigger warnings and to be upfront about your content to keep people safe.
You know, one of the games that we published last year is called Danielle's Inferno. And it's I say it's like a 16 plus. It's a dark comedy set in hell. And the only reason I put 16 plus is even though we've removed all of instances of the F word, the word nipple appears in the first 30 seconds. And I thought, I don't want a parent to get mad at me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I have to do, is like to put that rating on it, even though their children have seen much worse on YouTube, seen and heard. So we'll be talking a little bit about where are we drawing the line, what is the impact of serious games, and if you're not telling your story from your personal experience, to make sure that we all have a duty, like for example, because our game expresses subjects of PTSD and sexual violence, to make sure that we're also incorporating other survivors' experiences, not just our own, and to have professional advisors regarding the mental health aspects as well.
So if you haven't had the experience, consult with people that have. You can still make content and produce games and art and experiences about these sensitive issues, but you have to do it with kindness and you have to do it with knowledge, which you're not going to have on your own if you haven't personally experienced it. So even if it's as simple as hiring someone or talking to someone close to you that has had these experiences, getting them to play through and read and give you feedback on how it's represented, it's very vital and important, and I think it should be part of the course for all games and even art in general that does look at these very serious issues.
We're going to talk a little bit about our stories. So for me and my studio, it's the Charlaine Harris' Shakespeare's Landlord. For those of you that are not familiar with Charlaine Harris, she is an American novelist. She's sold over 36 million novels. She's best known for her Sookie Stackhouse series that became True Blood on HBO, which, by the way, was the biggest thing until Game of Thrones came along. So
I
vampires.
rewatched it recently, actually.
Oh, well, you know, with vampires and sex. But what was really interesting is that Charlaine had written the Lily Bard series back in the 90s, and I'll share a little bit more about that later. And we approached her looking to work with her because most of her work resonates with women over 30. We were very intentional about finding an author that we could amplify their stories that would meet our target audience, and that was Charlaine's audience until we picked this particular series. We didn't realize it kind of has some deep, dark stuff in it. So we'll get a little bit into the narrative design and the artistic design as well.
And I'll be talking about Shrinking Pains, which is a very different sort of game. Some of you may have played it, and it was made in 48 hours for a game jam, and it's interesting that these games with such quick turnaround that are made very spontaneously can have a lot more impact than you're expecting. And as mentioned earlier, we'll be talking about the impact of these games on the players as well as on the creators. But yeah, it was made in the majority of it, the bulk of the game was made in 48 hours. It's about a half an hour to 45-minute playthrough, and it's a fully realized game within that time period. And of course, it is a game that explores anorexia very specifically, and the effects that anorexia doesn't just have on the sufferer, but on their interpersonal relationships and their support networks. Because when one person is suffering or is mentally ill, that actually affects everyone around them, and those stories aren't highlighted or told either. And that was something I really wanted to explore a little bit.
Can I just say I'm really jealous that your game was done in 48 hours. It's been a year and a half. It's a very long game.
I mean, we had to fix some stuff up and make it pretty, but most of it.
Yes, yes. All right, so let's talk a little bit about mindfulness in crafting narrative for serious games. Specifically with Shakespeare's Landlord, the way that I pitch it to people is it's Nancy Drew meets Girl with a Dragon Tattoo. And, I can't even see my own little, here we go. So it's a point-and-click narrative game. I'm thinking now that there are going to be people who think, oh, wow, these guys are really capitalizing on the Me Too movement. And I just want to share that we signed this deal 4 years ago. And when I read the novels, all I could think in my mind was, Lily is a badass. Lily needs to be fully realized in games. We don't have enough badass women in games. And for us to be in the middle of developing it last summer, or what feels like the middle, it's much longer than that, to realize that we were doing this right in the middle of the Me Too movement has really changed the game. We're at this crest. All of these exciting things are happening, that we have a collective consciousness, not just in North America, but globally, has been incredibly important. So it deals with her. So Lily lives in a small town. She has moved to small town. She's been living there for 4 years. And one of the things that we were talking about with crafting the narrative was, well, it's super interesting how she, as a survivor, her relationships are very much affected by that. So we wanted to make sure that as we were creating the world, that it felt not only honoring the book, but survivors' experiences of why they might be hesitant to develop relationships, why they have trust issues. Little touches that we've added into the story are things like a diary that was never mentioned in the book, but for players, we just wanted to add the extra layer of being able to have her process her feelings in a way that the players could access them. I want to share, sometimes what happens in indie studios is your money situation fluctuates and you make bad decisions. So I'm going to share a little bit if you want to have a seat, or you can stand there because you are just so lovely.
I just want to support you.
Thank you. So truth be told, last summer, the clock was ticking on our IP, and we knew we had to move it or lose it. And I didn't have any money at the time. I would later go on to raise the money that we needed for the game, but it needed to get done. And sometimes you just get things done. And the two people that we had to write the game were men. And I didn't really feel great about that, because I don't feel like men should be writing the story about a rape survivor with PTSD unless it's a male rape survivor. So one of the writers was my husband, and he has continued to do some of the narrative design. And then the other fellow dropped out of the project because he had other commitments, which worked out well. We brought on another woman writer who was also a survivor. And between the three of us, we were crafting this narrative. But what ended up happening earlier this year is that we went to speak to Charlaine to show her the game demo in May. And let me tell you, you know what really sucks? When your principal person doesn't like your game. To get on that plane knowing that it was a shitty demo, yeah, it's a great feeling. But what was the result of that was coming home and spending the summer, feeling sorry for ourselves, but getting over it, and buckling down and recrafting the entire game. So we moved away from this whole idea of having a hidden objects game with bit of story to doing what we do best, which is the narrative. Forget these little clicky things. Let's focus on the narrative. Let's focus on the relationships between the characters. It was really important to make sure that that we had women writing the story. I am a survivor myself, and one thing that I do talk about is that there is a spectrum of what sexual assault looks like. So I've never considered myself to be on the same spectrum of somebody who's experienced an extreme sexual assault. Mine was minor. Mine was with stupid teenage boys. And it's not something that has harmed me or made me feel anxious to be around men, but I absolutely understand what it is like for other survivors who've had much deeper, more harmful experiences, because I know many women who have been assaulted. We really wanted to make sure that we got this story right. This is not something that we can take lightly. And that's our choice. That's our choice as developers, because I think we can agree that many people in the games industry don't take their ethical obligations seriously, right? So that's a little bit about Shakespeare's Landlord and the narrative piece of it.
Also, you can play it at PAX, so you should come and play it.
Yes, please do. I will say that it's, like, our games are very narrative heavy, and it's so amazing to watch a 12-year-old boy sit down or a 40-year-old woman sit down, and for both of them to have the experience of, wow, this is really cool. And I'm really looking forward to talking a little bit about our art styles as well.
All right, so I'm just going to touch on Shrinking Pains quickly as well. I don't have a cute tagline. It's just a game about anorexia and eating disorders. Really, this game is a visual novel, obviously. It's very close to my heart. This game is semi-autobiographical. So there are elements of this story that have happened to me and that have happened to people that I love and that have happened to other members of the team that made it. So it is a very personal story, which I think gives it a lot of credibility because we're not talking about things that have happened in the abstract to people. We're talking about lived experiences and we're trying to share them. The game itself is written in second person. I really enjoy writing games that explore mental health issues in second person with characters that aren't explicitly gendered, because one of the big things that I really want to do with my games that I release for free is to make the player empathize with the character that they're playing as. And if it's written without a clear gender and you can really make yourself part of that character, using second person makes it so immediate and it does make it a little uncomfortable. It's a way to get you to really connect with the lived experience. Also, what I think is really important in Shrinking Pains is the illusion of agency. So I believe that immersion plus agency equals increased chance of fostering empathy compared to other traditional mediums which you passively consume, TV, books, cinema. You are reading another person's story. In a game, you are playing another person's story. You are that much closer to the experience than you are if you're consuming media passively. It's active consumption. So in Shrinking Pains, you have the illusion of agency because you have all these choices and then the game takes them away from you. So at one point, for example, you're in front of the fridge and it's like, eat something or don't eat anything. And you just can't make the choice to eat because you don't have that choice when you're suffering at all. So the game does mimic that, and then it shows you that even if you're like, oh, obviously, like, just eat something, like, oh my God, that's ridiculous, you actually can't, and you have to go through what that character goes through, even for that moment. So of course, half an hour is very different to living with an illness, but it gives you even that little bit of insight and even that little bit of empathy, which can make a huge difference in our world. The more that we talk about these issues and have empathy for these issues, the more we destigmatize these issues, and we can further the conversation away from just being diagnosed to being treated to being accepted and loved and supported by society and by your interpersonal relationships as well. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a realistic exploration of disordered eating. It's snapshots. It's not a sustained narrative over a long period of time. It is only about a half an hour playthrough. I also wanted to make sure that it was short because it's really hard to play. You don't want to be in that person's mind for longer than you have to be. We had a lot of reviews that said, oh, make it longer, it's really short. I'm like, do you really want it to be longer? You really want to keep playing? This is pretty dark stuff. Like, this isn't fun for anyone involved. So I like that it is snapshots of this illness, which also, in a way, reflects what it's like to have the illness, because you lose time when you have an eating disorder. You lose a lot of your mental faculties, you lose time, you lose moments, and the game very closely reflects that, and I think it works really well as a short, contained experience.
So the biggest thing I think that both of us were talking about is, where do we draw the line? How do you know when you have crossed the line? And for narrative, on the narrative side of things, with Shakespeare's Landlord, wow. I read the book. Like I said, I read it and I thought, Lily's a badass. I like this. I signed the contract with Charlaine. And then about a year later, we started production on the game. And my husband was the first person to sort of start with the narrative design. And he came to me and he said, we're going to need to talk about chapter 5. Like, what do you mean? Well, chapter 5, and I just want to reiterate on the trigger warning, chapter 5 is the chapter in which Lily expresses to another character that she was abducted at gunpoint, that she was abused by multiple people, and also mutilated because they wanted to brand her. And I said to him, well, that's not an issue. It's not like we're going to gamify that. I have zero interest in showing or gamifying or having some kind of like revenge scene because she actually does kill her captor. somebody thinks it's funny to leave a gun with her, and she's either going to use it on herself to put herself out of her own misery, or she's going to kill her captor. It's like, we're not going to put that in the game. It's not a choose your own adventure of revenge. That's not what we're interested in communicating. And for the longest time, I was trying to think of, can we get through the entirety of the game without using the word rape? And because words are important. Words are absolutely important. And ultimately, we still haven't made the decision with regards to Lily, but there are several moments throughout the game, and the more that I have read or listened to the Audible, the more I realize that Charlaine has put so many nuances in there. It's set in 1996. She wrote this 20 years ago. We have not evolved with respect to sexual assault and misogyny. That shit is tired, and I would like to see us move past it. And maybe part of that is approaching this stuff in game content. It was shocking to me to realize, after talking with a couple of counselors, like Lily has an unhealthy, I wouldn't say an obsession, but she has an unhealthy interest in a 17-year-old boy. Now, think about 20 years ago. That's pretty cool. Old guys like young girls? Sure, no problem. Nobody would think anything of a 42-year-old man dating a 17-year-old. I personally, not cool with that. These days, I think the tides are changing. I think we kind of look at those relationships and we realize how inappropriate they are. And what was interesting in coming up with the conversation with the counselor was to say, many people who have experienced abuse go on to have inappropriate relationships in which the power dynamics are unhealthy, where there's a codependency factor in there, there's age differences, it's all about the power dynamic. And I went, so, do we put this into the game narrative? Is that too deep? At what point is it a point-and-click mystery? And what point is it a social messaging piece? There's rampant misogyny in the game. It's like, okay, like, how do we get that fine balance of living the experience of 1996? Is it really different from the experience that we have right now? And then finally, the triggering moment of the game is that Lily hears on the radio that a trial has just commenced and a rapist has been sent to prison, and that's actually the underlying thing of what happens to the person who ends up murdered. But she was 17 years old and married. So do we talk about teen marriage in this game? Like, at what point do we make those decisions? What is too much information? What is too much commentary on our social mores? But definitely not talking about the sexual assault in the graphic detail that we would see in something like Girl with a Dragon Tattoo.
So the line in Shrinking Pains is pretty clear, and that is that it wasn't going to be a how-to guide on how to be anorexic. There is a lot of risk with media that explores eating disorders, having a lot of explicit details of the disordered behaviour that is engaged. This is really common, and it can be good for people to talk about those experiences, but I personally didn't want to include any of that in the game because I think it's irresponsible. I don't want to give people ideas on how to hide their disordered eating, on how to participate in disordered eating, because I think that that is one of the worst things we could have possibly done within Shrinking Pains itself. So there are a few moments with food in the game where you see the main character's reaction to food and the idea of eating, but you never see any of the habits that they participate in to enact their eating disorder, if that makes sense. Also, one thing that is in Shrinking Pains is that there is a moment where there is some ambiguous consent and there's some blurred lines with a sex scene that does happen in the game, and I wanted to include that to also talk about risky behaviour without exploiting what actually happens. So it's cut quite short and you don't have to play it for too long, but it does illustrate that people that do suffer from like mental health issues and things like anorexia do engage in risky behaviour and that it can have very real life consequences. The other thing that I didn't want to do with Shrinking Pains is that when you play the game, you don't see what the character looks like, and part of this is, of course, as I mentioned, the second person and feeling attached and connected to the character when you play through the narrative. But on top of that, I didn't want to show the body of the sufferer. The only time you kind of maybe see the body of the sufferer is in like the branding, but even that is quite ambiguous and isn't really meant to be the character. It's just an image to put the game on the marketplace. But I think it's important to talk about the fact that someone who has anorexia or an eating disorder can be anyone. There's a rising trend seeing it within men and seeing it with people that are non-binary as well. It's a really serious issue that affects more people than everyone realizes, because there is an ideal held in society that it's for vanity or that it's a fluffy teenage girl's disease, which is very fallacious and very harmful. So I wanted to make sure that anyone could play this and feel like they could experience it. So not showing the body of the sufferer, to be exploitative and seeing bones and ribs was quite important as a line not to cross, but also as a way of opening up the narrative and the experience to more people.
And I think the thing that we're trying to get across is games can be uncomfortable without being exploitative.
Yeah, this is something I really was thinking about yesterday, in that an experience doesn't have to necessarily be a really beautiful, like lovely experience to get something across. Like, there is value in creating art, in creating experiences that can be harrowing and can be raw and can be real, and that people do actually have benefits from that. It doesn't always have to be packaged really beautifully. There is room in our industry and in the art world and within us as people to also partake of uncomfortable experiences. Of course, trigger warnings are important, and you need to get consent to have that experience with a player or anyone consuming what you're creating. But things can be hard, and they do have value by being hard as well.
Let's talk a little bit about the aesthetic. Our games have different budgets.
Very different.
Very different budgets. This is actually One More Story Games' largest game to date, and it was approximately, by the time we finished spending all the money on it, probably going to end up being well over 100,000 Canadian, which is roughly the same in Australian dollars. That is like 10 times the size of our previous budget, and a lot of that went to our art. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and here are some of the things that we chose not to include. We thought about, do we show Lily's scars? There's a mirror in her bathroom. Do we show Lily's scars? No, I'm not interested in showing Lily's scars. Some other game dev might have decided to include that, but for me, that's one piece that I wasn't really comfortable with. I'm gonna show you some of the other images that we included and how we changed the art style. Like, for example, last summer when we thought that we could make just like a really small version of this adaptation. It's only supposed to be a 3-month project. It's been a year and a half. No, I've never heard of feature scope or creep before. No, that's
production.
That's never happened. And this idea that we wanted to have, so it's a full color world with realistic art, and we were going to have these trigger images. So if she came across a stressful situation, a different color or different type of image would show up to convey her anxiety, along with the sound effects of her heart beating loudly and the labored breathing. And what was interesting is the art style that our director came up with at the time was kind of like horror-esque. It was black and red, and I'll show that to you. And I remember submitting it for, I think it was Indiecade, because we really did think we were going to finish it last year. And the only comment that we got was inconsistent art. I was like, what the hell is he talking about? And the more I thought about it, the more I really hated the trigger art. I really hated the black and red, because to me it felt grotesque. And this game is not grotesque. There are a lot of things that are grotesque in serious games, and they're important. But there needed to be a change. And so I'm going to show you what we did, that we shift from the horror aesthetic to the monochromatic. And also I'll talk a little bit about how we were very diligent and deliberate about the placement of the camera, because you are playing as Lily, and you actually don't ever see Lily in the game. So the premise of the game, you open it up and you find a body in the park. I didn't include those images. I mean, that's not really important. You find a body in the park and you click on it as you're opening this garbage bag that looks an awful lot like a human. And this is what you would see. Like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting, but doesn't it look like something out of a zombie game? Right? Like, what does that have to do with our subject matter? And I'm really glad that person ripped my heart out with their comment. No, I got over it, really. Feedback is wonderful. We
It's
love
great.
all feedback, right? And we went back to the drawing board and we ended up coming up with a different aesthetic. And the idea with each of the trigger art pieces is that it represents either a memory or a fantasy of Lily. And in fact, spoiler alert, this is actually the memory of the man's body that she had shot and killed. At the end of the first chapter of the game, she has a nightmare. And we're thinking, okay, well, we want to harken back to where she was captive. And what's interesting about this particular image here, as you can see where the man's face is looking, it's not looking at you. This is all sort of like out-of-body experiences with all of our trigger art. And we showed this to a couple of people who are PTSD survivors. And what struck me as the most interesting was for them to say, it's always the faceless men. In my nightmares, it's always the faceless men. And I knew that we had struck a chord, and that was very important to us to make sure that we were, obviously we can't tell everybody's story or everybody's experience with PTSD, but it really touched me to understand that for somebody with PTSD, which is not, you can have that from pretty much anything, right? I think we're starting to get a better handle on what is post-traumatic stress disorder. It could be something that was violent. It could be something that was non-violent. We're all human beings trying to process our emotions. And you can take a look, I mean, look at where the lens is of that barrel. Would that not be a very different image if that barrel was directed right at you? I don't want players to feel like it's directed at them. And that is an artistic decision that we made. And I hope that people see that it's the right one. Somebody had asked me at the last talk that I gave, well, why would you do this game in VR? Because...
That sounds great.
Yeah, let's have, you know what, there are going to be some people out there that do make a rape simulator in VR. It's going to happen. I think we can all agree that somebody stupid is going to do that. And maybe it will serve some noble purpose, but that's not the kind of game that I want to make. With the monochromatic, I was really quite impressed. Like a lot of these images evolved over the summer after we got the really shitty feedback from Charlaine, which was great feedback, right? And what I really love about this is Lily being haunted by the demons of her past, right? It's this bleeding of our past is always with us, it's always in our present, and it's not something that we can avoid. Some of the images that you're about to see are slightly unfinished. I'm not terribly crazy about this one because, you know, can we tell the story? The story is about Lily's survival. It's not about violence and the infliction of violence. Now, for those of you who are political news junkies with the American stuff going on, I'm Canadian. And
Just put it out there, I'm Canadian. All good.
Canadian, very sorry.
Not American.
Not American. The week I gave this presentation for the first time was the week that the Blasey Ford and Kavanaugh trials were happening. And we had just finished this piece a few weeks prior. So this is Lily's fantasy of how she never got to go to court and tell her story. And that is meant to represent all of the women who don't have an opportunity to confront their attackers, that don't have an opportunity to tell their stories. This is a really important piece because less than 1% of rapists actually see the inside of a jail cell. There are a lot of people who have stories that don't even get heard, and when they do speak out, you know, we talk about, well, they need to be the perfect victim. They need to be the perfect witness and all of these things. So this is a much more nuanced and complex game than we ever set out to make, I think. And I'm really particularly proud of that.
It's timed really well.
So I want to show you one of the images that I was like, hell no, is not going in the game. And I don't blame our artist for having created this or modeled this. They were trying to do something different, but as a woman, hell no. So I'm about to show you the image of a man holding down a woman, just so you know. And so I saw this model And in fact, I don't think he had shown it to us prior to painting it. You can get a sense of like, okay, well, that's just the 3D graphical model. And I do like the stylized thing that he did with it. It's very interesting. The aesthetic is very interesting. But again, it's that line aesthetically where I don't think we need to show that in order to convey Lily's experience. I think we can get Lily's experience through the narrative and not necessarily through art.
So I'll speak on the artistic approach of Shrinking Panes, which we're going to be going from some really, really lovely art to some game jam art. And our art is beautiful, but just be aware, 48 hours, okay? Just go easy on us.
I love your art.
Thank you. I didn't do this one. I learnt after this, but like our artists were amazing and working to really crazy time constraints. It was an absolute dream to work with them. I was very fortunate. The entire team was beautiful to work with. So as I mentioned earlier, we don't show the sufferer's body. There are a few visual cues which you'll see as I walk you through some of the art. This is Isabella. She's lovely. You break her heart, you monster. No matter what you do, she leaves you because you're very sick. So as you can see, this is the kitchen. It's a cute kitchen. I drink coffee in that kitchen. It's pretty cute. Go to the next one. As you play through the game, and a lot of people didn't realize this until consequent playthroughs, there are less details in this image than the previous one. So each time you play through the game, you'll start to notice that details start getting left out of the surroundings, and very slowly the tunnel, like you get tunnel vision, it starts to creep in at the edges, because one thing that sufferers do experience is not being able to see properly or really understand details in environments, because there's, you're not feeding yourself, you're not able to function at 100%. And also one thing that isn't uncommon is loss of vision. I'm not joking.
I did not know that.
So that can happen. You can start to lose details and peripheral vision, and it's not irreversible, it's more just that you're unable to compute the information. So next one. And then as you can see here, it's starting to tunnel in even more as the character gets quite sick. I mean, this quote does illustrate that. And here are some more examples. We always go back to the ceiling fan in the game because that ties into two of the endings about whether or not you sort of survive or not. It's very ambiguous. And I kind of use this because I wanted to make the player realise that we'd put this work in and that the details were going away, and so few people noticed, but that's fine. But as you go through, see, every time you see it again, it says, did your ceiling always look like that? People still missed it. It's fine.
Detail, less detail.
Less detail. And then even less detail as you get very sick. And it does mirror how the disease can affect you. The last one I'm going to show you is some food. So just, yep, that's happening. You can see, yeah, I was going to do a little more. It's all good, don't worry, it's all good. You can see here that there's food in the fridge because one of your friends brings it over trying to help you. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work like that, but well-meaning and lovely. And then, of course, the next one, you are losing details. And this option here says eat celery, which unto itself doesn't have a lot of calories, but you can't make that decision in the game. And as you can see, our art style was made to reflect how it feels to experience this illness, and those small things that other people may not realise are very inherent to what happens when you suffer from these things.
We're going to talk just a little bit about the experience that we've had with the interactions with players, and also the impact that the game's creation has had on the development teams.
All right, so here are some Steam reviews. That's pretty cool. We have Steam reviews. I mean, I'm excited about it. These are some nice ones. There are, of course, ones that are not so nice, which I will tell you about in a moment, because Steam reviews are an interesting place. Like there's one here that says 9 out of 10 would depress again. I was like, you go. Great. But as you can see, the ones that I've picked, if you want to read them, you can. But it had a lot more impact than I realised, and the game has been played so much more than I thought it was ever going to be played. Oh, I've got little goosebumps. It was a big experience. Like, for example, there are over 50 Let's Play videos of this on YouTube.
I'm kind of jealous.
It's been streamed a lot. Some players went into it and didn't read what it was about or the trigger warnings, and watching their reaction was interesting. But what I wanted to show you with some of these is that a lot of these reviews are from people that haven't suffered from disordered eating or anorexia, and they're saying that it gave them an insight into what it was like. And that's what I want to do with fostering empathy and understanding. And also, there was one, I'm not sure if I've got it up here, but they mentioned that their partner suffered, and their partner showed them the game so that they could, for a moment, have an idea of what she was going through and better support her. And I think that is beautiful and amazing. I could never have imagined that it would have been played by people like that in those circumstances and then have that impact. I was reached out to a lot personally, and I can't share that because I'm not going to out anyone that is suffering or that is recovering, and everyone's recovery does look different. But a lot of people did contact me privately to speak about the fact that the game was really good for them, even though it is a very harrowing experience, because there is a lot of media out there about eating disorders and empowering people with eating disorders, but the fact that this was semi-autobiographical and was so real made them feel seen and made them feel connected to someone else that had been going through this. A big part of an eating disorder or any mental health issue or illness is feeling isolated and alone because you're not functioning the way you're taught you should function, or that society models a stand-up member of a group or what you should be doing or how you should look, and that they felt seen and acknowledged, and that in that moment, even though it was hard to play, it made them feel human and connected to something. And that was really powerful, and I didn't expect it. It was really lovely.
I think that's the key thing, is you make these games and you tell your story, and then what we forget is that they resonate with people.
More than you can imagine.
We're releasing the playable demo this week. Some people have played the early versions of it, but I have been giving a lot of talks in the last couple of months about the game. And one of the things that I forgot was when you stand up and you share a personal story, or you share something that has the impact and the meaning that Shakespeare's Landlord does, is that people will come and they'll share their stories with you. And if you feel like you would like to share your story with us afterwards, we're open to that. We've sort of prepared ourselves for that because that does happen. But when I gave this talk in Houston a few weeks ago, a woman came up to me, and she was a psychiatric nurse, and she used to work with veterans. And not only was she very interested in seeing how we dealt with PTSD, because ultimately what I want is for players to have empathy for people who have anxiety and PTSD. That is like the driving mission for me with this game. And it was so eye-opening because I know a lot of statistics about assault that happens to women and assault that happens to children as well, but never really thought about the impact on men. And what she shared with me is that men who are in the armed forces experience high degrees of assault, and it doesn't get talked about. It doesn't get talked about, and more importantly, it's like this shattering of this illusion of masculinity. And I thought that is such an important thing that I want to make sure that I bring that forward with me in every talk that I give from here on out, because we can't get better if we don't share our stories. And that's why this kind of content is really important. Like you, I've had a lot of people private message me to say, thank you for your talk. I didn't want to put up my hand. I didn't want anybody to know that I too am a survivor. Last week when we were speaking, somebody had messaged me to say thank you. I will buy your game. I don't know if I can play it. And I respect that, right? These can be difficult games for people to play. And just because you're not able to play the game, that doesn't mean anything about you. It just means that you're not ready. This isn't about us trying to create content to fix people. It's to express a story that needs to be expressed. And everybody's on their own recovery timeline.
Yes.
So Ella, tell me a little bit about the impact that this has had on you.
Okay, I actually have a few quick notes. I think okay.
But it's lunchtime. Like, you guys don't need to eat.
Oh, dark.
Oh my God. Oh my God. I am never going to live that down.
No!
Shit.
I'm going to be eating lunch because I take care of myself now.
I am so sorry. I am so sorry.
I think we needed that after how heavy this got, so don't worry.
I am like beet red. Look, it's the same color. Please, Ella,
Okay.
take it away.
So I do have a few things to say, and I was walking home yesterday. We had a beautiful pajama party, as I mentioned, and we went through all of this, and it was lovely. I had the most beautiful night, and I was walking home, and I was like really resonating on what this did for me and what impact it had on me. And it did have a really big impact because I went into Game Jam and I was like, I'm going to make a game. And I kind of already knew I wanted to make this if I could at some point. I didn't realize it was going to be so soon. I didn't realize it was going to be so early in my recovery, because the reality is I've only been considered recovered from anorexia for about a year. And it's not something that I share very often, and I'm getting better about speaking about it and being open about it. And making this game really helped me do that. And I think that it's important to talk about these issues, and of course we want to sweep them under the rug because we want to function the way society tells us we should function. But there is power in owning our experiences and being able to still make something beautiful and be powerful and do things that we love, even when we've had these experiences, and do continue to recover or to have them. Because even though I say I'm recovered, no one is really truly recovered from an eating disorder. The reality is it's still always there, even a little bit. It's degrees. And I think that that is something that's important to talk about. But shrinking pains and what it did for me was being able to facilitate that conversation with others. And this is what I wrote down yesterday. And that is, I couldn't have believed how many people played it and how many people contacted me. And this was a game that was made in 48 hours for a game jam. It literally cost nothing. And we put it out there. I didn't do any marketing. I was super busy, and it did really well.
Really well.
Thanks. I could never have imagined that something so beautiful could have come out of the ugliest part of me. I'm fine.
Thanks a lot, Ella.
Oh, sorry. And also just that this experience could be hard to play and could be powerful without having to be softened or made into like a real gamified experience. I could just tell a story. Cool.
Thanks a lot, Ella. As for me, I plan to be a social justice warrior. I feel like these stories need to be told. Ella and I have submitted this talk along with another creator for GDC. And the other story is sort of like a Pan's Labyrinth style art. And it's being done by Lonely Egg Studios, and it's about a young woman who is being emotionally abused by her mother. That's going to be a real chuckle.
It looks amazing.
It's stunning, it's beautiful, and it's deep, and it's serious. And we need to tell these stories, so most importantly, that people don't feel like they're alone, and they also understand that these are survivable things. I'm willing to bet most of us have had some trauma in our lives, and hopefully we've had the opportunity to find the process to get us through that trauma and to heal from it. So I considered it an absolute privilege to get to tell this story. What's been really interesting in having done it in this time in history right now is that this game is getting mainstream attention from non-game magazines and possibly television, and it's the timing of things, right? We're ready to tell these stories, and I love that games is evolving. See it?
We're fine.
Super sexy. It's time, and it's been an absolute pleasure to explore this with you. And I think that if you want to explore sensitive subjects in serious games, there are a lot of great resources. I see that Matthew Lee is here.
Oh no, my Bitly link didn't work. That's all right, just Google.
That's my fault.
Just Google Shrinking Pains and play it, and leave us a nice Steam review, please.
Yes.
Don't leave one that just says, I wish this was a size fetish game. Yeah, I actually got one that said that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Please don't do that.
There are some great resources online there's a serious game SIG of the IGDA. Matthew Lee is here. There are some really great resources out there. Come join us. Come tell your stories. It's an exciting time to be in indie dev because I can't see Ubisoft making these games. They're not going to make these games. It's up to us. And finally, I want to say thank you very much to Film Victoria, because they flew me out here from Toronto so I could give this talk and the talk that I gave yesterday. And I really appreciate the welcoming reception that we've had from the Australian game dev community. So thank you very much. And we're available for questions if you like. Are they going to kick us out of the room?
Maybe we could, huh?
We have like a few minutes? Well, because there's the break now.
Yeah, it's also like if you want to speak to us instead of going out into the world and there being lots of people around, maybe it's nicer to keep it in here.
Yeah, so feel free to come up and speak to us. And thank you very much for listening to a heavy hour. And I hope that you got something of value to take with you. Thank you.
Thank you.